Hey YouTube, and welcome back to It Just Clicked. In our last video, we talked about division, fractions, decimals, and percentages, but I wanted to talk about some of the patterns that exist within them. But there are a lot of patterns, and I didn't want to make the last video very long, so I decided to do a separate video to show some of them. The first pattern I want to talk about is simplifying fractions, and it's pretty straightforward because it's basically division. An easy example of simplifying a fraction might be something like 2/4. 2 over 4 is the same thing as 1 over 2, because it's half. 2 is half of 4, so we can reduce this 2 over 4 to 1 over 2. But how do we actually do this? We do it by dividing both the numerator and the denominator by the same number. So in the example that we just gave, we would divide both the numerator and the denominator by 2. A more complex example of this might be 32 over 72. We could see that both 32 and 72, if we know our multiplication tables, are divisible by 8. So if we divide both of them by 8, we get 4/9. This means that 32 over 72 is the same thing as 4/9. Those numbers are equal to each other. And if we remember from the fraction table that we showed at the end of the previous video, you would know that 1/9 is 0.1 repeated. So 4/9 would be 0.4 repeated. The 8 that we divide 32 and 72 by is called the greatest common factor. The reason it's called the greatest common factor is because if we were to divide by 2 or 4 in our example, that wouldn't get us to the simplest form of the fraction, so we would have to do more dividing. Now I want to talk about some of the patterns in the numerators and the denominators of fractions. So for example, if we have the fraction 1/5, we know that that's equal to 0.2, or we could call that 20%. So when we look at the numerator for 1/5, we know that for every 1, we're going to have that amount. For every 1/5, we're going to have 0.2. So if I have 3/5, then I'm going to have 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2, which is 0.6. This is useful because it can help us find numbers relatively quickly. If we remember that zero point 0.2 is the value of a fifth, then anytime we see a fifth, we're going to know how much it is, because it can only be 1 through 5. So it's either going to be 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, or 1 if it's 5 over 5, or 5/5. This goes for any kind of fraction. So even if we have something like 1/4, for example, which would be 0.25, then we know that 2/4 is going to be 0.25 plus 0.25, or 0.5, which is the same thing as 1/2, like we talked about in our previous example of 2/4 being reduced to 1/2. The pattern for the denominator is a little bit different. So instead of adding, like we did with the numerator, like 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, instead we're going to either multiply or divide. So for our example of 1/4, we know that 1/4 is 0.25. So if we multiply that by 2 and get 1/8, then we have 0.125. And what's interesting about that is 0.125, if we think about it as a percentage, is basically 12.5%, which is half of 25. So if we double our denominator, then our answer is cut in half. So what happens if we cut our denominator in half? So for the example of 1/4, which is 0.25, what happens if we divide that by 2 and go to 1/2? We get 0.5, which is basically double 0.25. So now we know if we take our denominator and cut it in half, we'll double our answer. So when we multiply the denominator by 2, we have our answer. And when we divide the denominator by 2, we double our answer. We can do this with any kind of multiplication or division, not just 2. So if I want to multiply my denominator by 3, then the new answer that I'll get will be 1/3 of the answer that I originally had. In the same way, if I divide my denominator by 3, my answer will be 3 times my original answer. You might be starting to realize that it's really important to know things like your multiplication tables, nice numbers, and fractions as decimals, because these will all be really powerful tools that you can use to solve problems and equations in the future. And the last pattern I want to talk about is with percentages. Basically, a percentage of a number can essentially be the inverse of itself. So let's say, for example, 26% of 50 is the same thing as 50% of 26. This can be really helpful because you might not know 26% of 50, but we do know that 50% or half of 26 is 13. This works with any percentage of any number. So 30% of 120 is 120% of 30. And that's actually going to do it for this little bonus video on patterns. I hope you enjoyed it, and always remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for checking it out.